Like 5
Go.
minutes.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Tyler. This is my compatriot, Ben. How you doing, Ben?
Fine.
So let's do the quick audio-visual check. I'm hoping you guys can see me. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Audio visual good.
Okay. Now Max has spent a good, 20, 30 minutes on the lighting changes? Or 2?
Well, if you include the amount of time I spent watching YouTube videos.
There you go.
On lighting.
So I'm expecting some backer to do a comparative analysis to 2 weeks ago when Ben and I were sitting here versus this week and let us know if it's improved or not. I guess we're not Andrew was changing the light color of the light back here just a moment ago, but he's disappeared since.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's. Every once in a while, I like to do a little preamble. We do a weekly update, really trying to make sure that backers are informed of what we're doing. It's kind of an effort for transparency. Give you the highlights of the week. Let you ask questions. This week, as most weeks when Ben and I are sitting here, I expect it to be chock full of design questions that cover pretty much the entirety of the game as well as theoretical, and I will sit here and maybe answer one question. You think that'll happen?
It should be all art.
Which is fine. I'm not trying to make an accusation.
Ask why the trees are square.
Well, I thought you'd want to know, Tyler.
We did have square trees at one point.
Lotoween says the lighting is making Tyler's hair look better than before.
Oh, right. Let's see. All right, so what we try and do is go over the highlights of the week. Those highlights were kind of a top 10, and they've turned into the top 10-ish over the last couple of years, just as the team grew, as the amount of work we were getting done each week grew. So we have our top 10-ish of 14 items. I will go ahead and work through them, and then we'll go into Q&A, and then we'll be done. And if you have further questions or anything like that, you can pop onto the forums, et cetera, et cetera. What? You're giggling too much for me to not pay attention.
Just keep going.
Okay.
And
All right.
then after that...
And then after that, we'll turn the stream off, and then after that, I'll get up. Okay. Let's see. Number 1, work in progress tech Navmesh. Navmesh is nearly ready. Lee spent the week testing various path plan archetypes and fixing any bugs that he found. Really, this is the final step in a very long process. All the code that's been put in over the last couple of months is finally getting tested and exercised, and in some cases exorcised. All the bugs are getting found, which when Ben and I wrote that, we realized we should probably put in a for now.
I didn't write this.
I think someone else wrote this one. All the bugs are getting found for now until we get more testing and find out what doesn't work. And worked out, from the stupid simple typos to the glaring logic errors that cause complete rewrites of sections of code. While this sounds like a lot of work, it is. It's also the final step before checking in code. Soon, my pretties, you shall have a full 3D path planning with a dynamically built Navmesh. So this is just one of those giant, I think it was spec'd out around like a 6-month type of thing that Lee's just been kicking ass on to try and get it so that if you haven't been paying attention or watching these streams, so that our NPCs, and that could be anything from a wolf to a dragon to a guard or whatever, actually can path around in our 3D environment and act smart. Let's see. Windows 7. Tim and Mark Che tracked down an issue that was plaguing Windows 7 users. We found a way to address the issue, and it can be found here, which if you read this, the actual update will have a document linked. Also a reminder, I think this should say below. Also, as a reminder to those of you still using Windows 7, it is our position that all users running Windows 7 should upgrade to a newer version of Windows as soon as possible. Microsoft will be ending its official support for Windows 7 as of January 14th, 2020. Once Microsoft drops support for Windows 7, so too will CSE. We won't do anything to intentionally break builds on Windows 7, but we will no longer be officially supporting it. If you are currently on Windows 7, please follow the steps in this doc, which are going to be linked in the update, to address any issues you are currently having. I believe this was also in last weekend's playtest as well. There was some mention of this and things that if you were running a Windows 7 you would need to do.
I can't click on this link.
You cannot click on this link. Though I'd love to see you try. And I'd be more amazed if you were successful. Number 3, work in progress, tech tools. Bull continued his work on our change list versioning system for content data. This is also my second or third spell check, grammar check as I read this out loud. Versioning system for content data. Once this is landed, we'll be able to hotfix content instead of having to take down the servers to apply the changes. This will hopefully help us iterate a bit faster and work toward our live game stability and sustainability. Number 4, work in progress tech tools again. Bull and Andrew also tested and deployed a fix for our animation data builder. The data builder is what allows us to version control the animation data. This has been a long needed addition in our animation tools pipeline, which is probably what's going on right now because I think we were waiting for stuff to build and I think we're rebuilding all the animations right now.
Oh.
That's you remember the trees we were trying to find? I think they're all sitting behind building all the animations.
Okay. We misplaced the trees earlier.
Bull and Andrew also... Oh, I just did that one. Number 5, tech knockback. You want to read this one? I know you like knockback.
I do. What does it say? Matt continues to work on predicting knockback on the client. This is mostly done. Deep support work on the server and networking predictions. The client is starting to predict knockbacks themselves, and we'll be evaluating them on the client before the changes go live. So, because we use server-based physics, we have to simulate all of our knockback and things on the server, but then the client also has to predict it, and they have to stay in sync, and it's difficult. So Matt is making it work.
Do you want to keep going, or do you want me to keep going? You and I are very relevant to this one.
I can read this one, I think.
I think.
Well, it's questionable. Rob started work on making placeable objects terrain relative in the editor, which means that it is when objects are placed upon the terrain, they stick to the terrain, allowing artists to drag objects across the ground quickly without having to continually move them up and down as they work.
Actually, I should point out, pointed at the angle of the terrain. I should actually add I mean, it's important to me.
It is, well, as I pointed out in that meeting, like, sometimes you want things to be straight up and you don't care about the angle of the terrain.
Yeah.
And sometimes you do want them to be angled with the terrain because
basically,
otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
Basically, if this is the terrain and I put it on the terrain normally without this, if I placed it, I have to kind of do this and put it right where I want it. With the terrain relative, the duck will kind of swim along at its origin point and stick to the ground. And then if it's at an angle, he'll sit at an angle, and then we can flag it so that it sits upright. So if you're placing a lamppost, you don't want the lamppost to do this unless you purposefully want it to be an awkward lamppost. And so you can just kind of drag it, place it, be done, instead of all this little fiddling to get it to fit right on the terrain.
Yep. So that's what that's all about, is just making sure that we can
do it faster.
Yeah, make level building faster.
Do you want to keep
What's
going, or do
this
you want me
one?
to keep going?
Yeah, I don't know what this is.
More Linuxification. This week, Wiley was performing hardening for low-level code on Linux. This involves a lot of testing on the Linux virtual machine in order to isolate OS-specific bugs. The Linuxification effort is being done to help reduce server costs.
So, what does this do?
His specific thing?
Yeah, what is this specific?
You're asking the artist the engineering-centric thing about Linuxifying a server.
Yeah, because you wrote
I have
it, right?
no idea what he's specifically doing.
Okay.
Hardening for low-level code on Linux. That seems like we should emergency call an engineer over here out of their work to explain this. And if anybody actually is really interested for more information, that's a good forum question or Discord or something like that.
I think we could elaborate that.
But granted, we've covered a lot of Linuxification over the last few weeks, so if you go back a few updates, there's plenty of information. Tech UI bug fix. AJ fixed a bug with the scenario join button. The scenario join button will no longer get stuck on joining when attempting to join a scenario. Typically, we don't put too many bugs in the updates unless they're fairly important ones that we want to make sure players know about. And not being able to get into a scenario is fairly important. Music. This week, DB focused on new sample instruments for new music tracks. Setting up new sample instruments expands our library as well, allowing DB to not only create new music, but also improve pre-existing tracks if applicable.
What ones went into the sound bank this week?
I didn't specify which and what. Sometimes it's drums, sometimes it's horns.
Didgeridoo?
Sometimes it's string instruments. Kind of depends on the realm, the theme, etc., etc. Tech gameplay. Anthony fixed a nasty bug with skill stability. Under some conditions, a player's stability, well, this again sounds like a terrible one. Player stability could be set to 0, ensuring that all their abilities would be interrupted from any attack.
Yeah, that's maybe not good.
I blame you. Once this reaches the servers, we ask that you please report any oddities with stability. Art props. Tyler did some experimenting with animations and FX on props. This work should inform our ability to do animations on things such as the Stone Healer stones. The original implementation of the Stone Healer stones, I think, was like a code-based, like, I don't remember how we exactly did it. It wasn't animated, but it rises out of the ground.
Things that move are animated.
No. Like it wasn't an actual animation, is what I'm saying. No artist.
Oh yeah,
animated
it wasn't.
that. Yeah,
it was
So-
all in code.
So basically, I was just doing some prop testing to verify that the props, when they're spawned in the world, can play animations.
Yeah.
And in this specific case, Sandra helped me out by creating a few different animation loops, such as a floating rock as a test asset for Tyler's investigations. So this is basically just something that moves that I can just verify everything works as expected, and then we can use this on all different types of things. Art, weapons, spears. We completed 2 new spear models this week for the TDD. Short and simple. 14 art terrain textures. We've previously talked about using Substance Designer for new materials. This week we worked on new snow and rock textures for new areas of the world. I was currently putting a couple of pictures of that in the update with a brief description of kind of how that works with a link to the program we're using. So any future or current artists who haven't played with this, totally a fun thing. It's fantastic. Okay, that's our top 14. Please let us know if you have any questions.
All right, give us your questions. And we know that you're all very excited to ask Ben all the design questions.
All the design questions.
Only art questions.
But the first 2 are for Tyler.
Okay.
Good.
So enjoy.
With my bubbly.
Brand asks, Tyler, we only get to see a handful of cool art stuff in weekly updates. How much art stuff is ready to be added to a more definitive game environment that we haven't seen?
Generally, there's a lot of little background pieces. A lot of times, if we build out a biome or something, there's quite a few pieces. Even if you dragged it out of me, and I probably did a bit of research, I know we've created we'll make 5 bushes. We'll put 3 of them in the game, and then the other ones are extras for a whole new biome or something. I try not to. The problem is you kind of want to pick a certain number of things to kind of be a scene, and if you overdo it, then it just ends up being cluttered, and then you've basically shot yourself in the foot because you don't have stuff for later. So there's actually quite a few assets. It kind of depends on where you are and what you're doing. So I think I would say there's kind of a few items that haven't been put in the game at this point. I'm guessing. It kind of depends also if Ben goes in and finds something and is like, and I'll be like, I forgot all about that. We didn't finish it or something like that.
Well, there's maybe a bunch of stuff that's not actually been imported into the editor yet.
I don't think at this point, there's too much of that. I mean, sometimes when we're kind of, against a clock trying to put something together or an area, we might focus on a few assets versus trying to get everything in. Just because the time we've got, I can spend a lot of time importing a few things that won't have much consequence, or I can actually work on the level. Like the control point thing, that was a lot of time. That was, putting that whole thing together was a lot of time. So it was more about getting in quality over quantity.
No, the clickety-clack noises are from the artists nearby, not from me. Now, Lottoing tricked me about this second question. It says for Tyler, will trees, for Ben, be affected by panic? For real. Is the only method of clearing max panic for a character in the range of a Dark Fool's aura to have an ally kill the Dark Fool, since Dark Fools are too fast for another character to just run away from them?
That sounds more like a balancing issue.
I think it depends on if there are any trees nearby.
Panicked or non-panicked trees?
Yeah.
Supporting trees?
If the trees are very supportive, then maybe that will help.
So basically what we need to do is need to put in a special type of tree that has a negative panic...
calming
a calming effect that when you get close enough to it, when you're panicked, can calm you down. That's actually, not specifically a tree, but if we had rocks or some, stone or something.
It can't be a tree, but it can be a rock. I see.
Well, I was trying to come up with some kind of lore, like some kind of cairn or something that
Tim suggests emotional support trees.
Emotional support tree.
That is an excellent one.
I just we need like a little spell that builds an emotional tree floating rock that hovers around with you and gives you like
animate now, apparently.
yeah, exactly. It gives you a bonus to like resist panics. And we put a little a vest around it too. That's orange. Like the little emotional support dogs have little vests.
That's true.
All right, now it's a turtle. See, now my brain keeps
Now
going.
there's an
Now it's an
emotional
emotional support turtle. I went from rock to turtle.
But yeah, you do generally have to get support classes to be out of range of the people that they're attacking or supporting if you can't actually kill them. But you can shut down their auras as well, depending on which types of abilities you have. Like if you have a silence or something, then they wouldn't be able to persist those auras.
Boom Headshots asks a question.
Boom Headshots.
Boom Headshots also asked this, I think during Morning with Max. But we are asking Ben this time. What designs are in place to counter the Zerg or overpopulation for a realm? Are there any underdog mechanics that buff incentivize weaker realms to keep fighting? Will there be incentives for new players to roll a specific realm if they are underpopulated?
I feel like this type of question comes up often enough, and granted over a period of time, that we should just put together like a little list of vids and stuff because it's been talked about.
Just have a frequently asked questions
section? Yeah, do we have that? But in video format.
I don't think so.
Because I think there was one where Mark went on
answers.
and on about it.
Yeah, but this is a question that Mark likes to answer because it's one of the things that he has gone into a lot of explanations on previously and really cares a lot about because that's a major problem in these sort of games, right? Is when one team gets too overpopulated or just too far ahead progression-wise or whatever, and then just the other teams just
Or
lose,
you build
and
an
then they
engine with
start
a whole
losing
lot
players.
of people in a battle.
Well, that's not really related. It's just
Sure.
a matter of imbalance, right? Where
Sure.
if it doesn't matter really if you have hundreds of players or thousands of players, if one team is overpopulated, then the other teams are not going to have as much fun. And so there are a number of things that play into addressing those problems. The first one and the most major one, of course, being that this is a 3-faction game. And so you don't have a case where if you have 2 factions and one of them has 52% of the population and the other has 48% of the population, one is overpowered and the other one is underpowered and tends to be at a disadvantage. So even if the factions are a little bit skewed one way or the other, the 2 lesser populated factions can sort of gang up on the more overpopulated faction, and things tend to sort of self-balance themselves a little bit that way. But there are a number of other things as well. I mean, this is something that comes up across a lot of areas of the design, but we haven't really discussed exactly what we will do, like the most heavy-handedly if all of the other things fail, right? If we're going to actually go as far as to say certain realms will get an inherent buff or something if they have way too few players, or we'll get more progression rewards or whatever to help them compensate. But we might have to go that route, and we've talked about it a little bit, but haven't gotten into any specific details. But we're not beyond saying that if there's nothing else we can do, that we wouldn't necessarily put in things like that. But we're hoping that by having these things sort of built into the way that the resources spawn and the way that the realms are laid out and the way that the map moves as the islands are taken over and things like that, and once again having a 3-faction game, that this won't be as big of an issue as is necessary to have more direct and heavy-handed solutions.
How about we jump over to one for Tyler before going back to the Ben questions. Brand asks, hey Tyler, is art quality, resolution, and art style at the desired point, or is it still a bit of a work in progress as you adjust lighting things and whatnot? Is there more you want out of the look and feel of things?
All of the above. Let's start off with the problem with artists. One, you're never generally happy with what you've done. You always want to do more. As with anything, there's only so much time to do what you want to do. So just even like with design, you have more things you want to do and you don't have enough time to do them. There is still definitely more that we want to do with the game in terms of lighting, just kind of bringing the whole thing together. Color grading, there's some systems that aren't finished around that. There is a lot. And then there's also, like I said, there's only so much time. There's only so much you can do. There's still plenty I want to do. I know that there's still tech that we want to do for the crafting system, which personally I think would be a shitload of fun. Just being able to like craft something in the materials that you make and the quality of the materials you make to find the first visual, and then afterwards you can tint them. All of that sounds really exciting. I really want to do that. Animations, I still want to do more stuff with the animations. Some of those things are limited by technical needs. It's kind of a never-ending story to a certain degree. There's always more that you want, and granted, this isn't always just art, but I will say yes to all of that.
Well, yeah, so if you look at the playtests that we're running now, or any screenshots or past videos that we've done, that's not necessarily going to be very indicative of the way that the game looks when it's launched.
Yeah, there's a lot of, even just simple things like changing time of day, changing the lighting and rendering, fixing rendering bugs. There's some issues that we want to investigate with the fidelity of materials. There's a lot of things that, it's just a matter of time and scope.
Real Life Gobbo asks, what types of professions can a crafter be, e.g. weaponsmith, stonemason, etc.?
So crafters can sort of generalize. Again, crafting is a really big area for Mark to answer for the most part. But we haven't gone into like where there are actual like subclasses like that.
I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've said that.
Yeah, we haven't.
It's more like craft the world.
Well, you do gain proficiency, sort of like with combat classes. The things that you use, you get better at, right? So you won't necessarily be able to make everything as good as possible.
Yeah, you're not necessarily a cook or a weaponsmith, unless you decide to focus on those things.
Yeah, well, if say cooking and weaponsmithing or any of those examples, right? If you don't spend an equal amount of time on any two things, you won't be equally skilled in those two things, right? So you will be better at the things that you make the most or that you work on the most, but we're not going so far as to say that like you have to choose a profession, right? Let's say in one of these games where you can choose to be an armor smith or specialize in one specific area, and then to the exclusion of others. You can sort of work on the things that you want to work on, and in a skill-based way get better in proportion to the amount of time you put into each one thing.
That jogged my memory of Final Fantasy XI, which I think you could pick two things, or was it open?
I don't know for 11.
I just remember I made a lot of sandwiches.
Sorry, now I'm thinking about sandwiches. Zumos Gaming on YouTube asks, can you explain a bit more about how the depths is built into the RVR system? I believe you can fight for control of the area. How do you see that working?
So we haven't really given away a lot about how the control of that is going to shift, but there are entrances in various places throughout the world, and through part of the territory control mechanic, you will be able to open access for your realm, and basically only one realm gets access to the depths at a time. But access just means that they have access to the entrance. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the only ones who are in the depths. So if the Arthurians, let's say, have been in the depths for a while and are gathering things and exploring and whatnot, and then the control shifts to the Vikings, then the Arthurians are still in the depths, but they can't re-enter because the entrances have been shifted to the Viking realm, and the Vikings now can enter. So if the Arthurians are killed off, they can't respawn there anymore. So they're basically just surviving as long as they can. And sort of the fun idea of the depths is that when the control shifts and your realm is the realm who's in the depths, you can set up all of these traps and take control of some of the NPCs and try to basically hold out as long as you can, not being able to respawn, as the other realm now has free access to come in. So that's sort of how that works in a general sense, but the specifics exactly of how it works is something that we're going to save for a bit later on when we actually get to the closer to at least the implementation, so we can start showing it off.
Odilvik asks, is the plan to use light sources to illuminate the world with limited whole zone floods, or will it be a mix? Might some races get ultra infra / vision?
I think that was kind of two different things. The world lighting is technically, there's a whole what did Andrew originally call it? There's a whole sky system where it replicates, you know, the
Jan Welkin.
The season, the what?
Jan Welkin.
You're making things up now.
Okay.
It does all the seasons. It has planetary bodies, the sun and the moon, the time of day. The zones are mainly done in that manner. The whole infravision and stuff like that is more of a design, and as well as like an overlay type of mechanic.
Yeah, so I think it would definitely be fun to, as we get some of our more non-human races into the game, to give them different vision mechanics. There's certainly like a vision stat to say like how far you can see and things like that, but it doesn't get into statistically anyway the qualities of how well you can see in the dark. But I think that would definitely be a fun trait to add to specific races.
We talked about this a while back. This is one of those things like, you know, time and tech of doing with the vision system that we've talked about, where one player might see someone before someone else sees someone.
Hambone Flex asks, for a long-term project such as Camelot Unchained, how do you as a team keep morale up? Since this is a marathon project and not a sprint, are there any instant gratification goals that get met?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think sometimes when like a system like the Navmesh comes in, or you know, I mean, for the art team, hey, we've got a whole new section of work done and it looks cool, or oh, hey, we've added some new tech in that updates the lighting. You know, things like that are usually big boosters to me. Or, you know, hey, there's a new class, we're playing with it. Oh, we're doing a play test in the office. Oh, this is actually fun.
So getting a little bit into the production side of things, we do sprints, right? And so at the end of every sprint, there's a set of deliverables. And so we're trying to provide a specific set of features at that point. And then starting to a new sprint, we break up our teams differently.
Yep.
And then we have new goals that would have to be met within a specific time frame. And so it's not just a monotonous plodding along of, you know, day after day doing sort of the same thing. It's a lot of variety.
Changing.
There's a lot of different things that constantly have to be done, and there are a lot of sub milestones and goals to reach along the way. So it's not just the goal is to finish the game and we're just working towards finishing the game. It's like, you know, the goal this week is we're trying to get these new models in, and we're trying to get these new classes in, and we're trying to do this playtest on this day, and we have to get a build ready, and we are doing a playtest this weekend with backers, so we got to make sure that everybody can log in and there's no bugs, and the servers are going to be ready. And so there's all of these little sub goals and just constant things we're trying to accomplish that are along the way to finishing the game, but we're not just constantly looking at the end. We're looking at, you know, day to day, week to week, and from one sprint to another, what specific things are we trying to put in.
Plus, and I spoke about this in last week's update, I think it was last week's, about just the constant variety of challenges. Like, it does technically get kept fresh, you know. Like, Lee is probably the guy who might be going oh, God, I want to try and get this done so I can have a new problem to solve. You know, those are big problems.
And Mike, we were saying the other day, right? Mike D.
Which thing? The ragdolling stuff? Yeah. Same type of thing. Like, some of these things can be long. And even for artists, you know, I always tell people, like, let me know if you're starting to get a little brain dead on something or the creativity is getting lost, and we'll just kind of put something else new in to work on. So it's you just kind of try and keep it fresh as you keep moving through sprints.
Real Life Gobbo asks, any plans for environmental damage, e.g. damage to a tree to make it fall over, or deal lots of fire damage to it to catch it on fire?
Not at this time that I'm aware of. I think when we've talked about things like this in the past, I think part of the issue was having to make like every tree an entity. Every tree would need to be tracked on the server, and every tree would need to, you know, be able to keep a stat like that, whether it be damage. Plus, then you'd have to do the rendering updates, which is also be expensive, like during combat and stuff like that, especially when we've got really thick forests. So nothing like that is planned at this time. I think mainly around like a technical concern with the scale of a zone's number of players, the amount of things that could possibly be going on.
I'm still hoping we get to do the anti-trees.
Wait, say what was that about?
Where, like, you don't want all of the trees in the world to be an entity, right? So you don't keep track of all of the existent trees. You keep track of all the non-existent trees.
Right.
So there's there.
I don't remember this.
Yeah, it's just a silly tech conversation of how do you do that? How do you make it so you can chop down any tree in the forest, right? Of like, what are we tracking and what are we actually keeping?
So only keep track of the trees that have left,
Yeah,
not all the trees that are there.
There's some silliness that goes on
I don't recall it.
So it would be nice if we could just let you run around in the game, chopping down any tree that you want, and having forest fires and things like that would be amazing. But we'll have to see where we get as far as the technical side of that, because that is more of a technical question than a design question. Because from a design perspective, of course, that would be amazing. But there's sort of reasons games don't tend to do this. But we're doing a lot of things that other games don't tend to do. So we'll see what we can do.
Ryan on YouTube asks, will it be possible to craft something offline, similar to EVE Online, where an upgrade can take a week?
Again, the crafting questions. Crafting is a really good thing to ask Mark about. But I think there are jobs that will run unattended for an amount of time. I don't know if you can be offline or not.
See, once again, this is a great Mark question, because usually he fields like an hour of crafting questions. And if you go back through the YouTubes, or not the YouTubes, go through the YouTubes. I sound like my grandfather. If you go back through our vids, maybe on Twitch, there's different points we've talked about that, or search through like the news articles. But if I recall, like the idea was you'd set up something building, go offline, and it takes days for it to, like something big and epic takes a while. If I recall correctly.
I know it does take a while. I think
I don't think
now
it
in
stops
the game
when you're not there.
Yeah, right now in the game it doesn't
That would suck.
Stop while you're not online. But your crafting station does have to stay in the world, and so that is vulnerable to being destroyed or whatever. So you want to keep it like in your castle or someplace that hopefully won't get destroyed while you're offline.
Byproducts asks, hey Tyler, speaking of the
Hey,
depths, how much of that has been concepted out or even completed? Are you keeping the HR Giger style?
That was for God, I can't remember at this time. I hate if I can't absolutely remember what we said. I believe that was that post launch, the whole depths thing.
I hope not. But
we're not.
If
we're,
somebody has said that,
sorry,
I'm
let's
unaware
just
of it.
say I can't remember. We have not focused on that right now. We're more focused on the general world.
So we did start on doing some cave sets for having interiors.
Yeah.
And then we ran into some lighting issues.
Terrain issues. There's a few technical hurdles that still need to be done, like cutting holes in the ground so that I can actually attach where that thing goes, stuff like that. So, no, we've been mostly focused on the world. It's a cool thing, though. That's probably why we keep getting asked.
Okay. Well, here's a question about balance. Maybe we know this one. Hellweir asks, in a game that balances around the rock paper scissors concept, are you not concerned that not launching with certain archetypal classes like stealthers/scouts could create large balance problems, either by their initial absence or later inclusion? Put another way, a rock paper scissors balance, but there's no scissors until, say, 6 months after launch.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. Not so much for scouts, because they're not especially focused on combat. So when we're talking about rock, paper, scissors, we're mostly talking about the combat elements of that. Although there's a strong interaction between crafters and scouts that I think will be interesting. That, again, anytime you have a set of pieces that are meant to play together, if you're leaving one of those pieces out, there's going to be a hole that isn't filled, and so that's going to create a somewhat of an imbalance until that's resolved. But sort of the same thing is true if you ever had a set that you considered complete, and then you found yourself adding to it later, because now you're filling a gap that didn't exist before, and now you're sort of throwing your previously theoretically balanced set into imbalance by adding something that wasn't initially planned. And so anytime you have a game where it launches with a certain set of things and then gets added to later, that's going to cause some degree of disturbance to the previous order. And so the fact that we may not be able to deliver all of the classes that we would like to initially at launch, and some of them may come in later, we're also going to add more classes that are not currently planned to the game after launch. And so there are going to be even more classes coming in that aren't in the current mapping of, what the rock, paper, scissors interaction looks like. So we really have to look at this when we're talking about rock, paper, scissors, lizard Spock, whatever, as you look at those sort of, well, because it grows, right?
Yeah,
and as the number of
it's a good analogy.
Classes come together, the benefits and detriments of the different interactions between those classes gets very complicated. You have to look at it a little bit less analogously in a literal sense to this class equals rock, this class equals paper, because you can sort of look at it more generally in terms of features and roles, let's say, and say that, like, well, if you have a pure healer versus a hybrid healer, that just is a sort of a healing feature, and so you could look at that being more analogous to one of these roles. And then what counters healing, not necessarily what counters hybrid healers versus what counters pure healers. It's like, well, if you have an anti-healing ability, it works against all healers, and so the same thing with damage, right? If you have like some multiple classes that deal magic damage, say, spirit mages versus regular caster mages, if something is immune to magic damage or counters magic damage or reflects magic damage, and both of those classes are dealing magic damage, well, you can sort of look at those as being along the same lines and sort of fulfilling not necessarily the same gameplay flow and mechanics and things like that, but sort of the same role that they would go into a group. So I wouldn't say that necessarily if some of these classes are missing, it won't be as big of a deal, but it certainly is something that we have to look at very carefully and make sure that our initial launch offering offers good coverage in all of the general roles and general functionalities that we need in order to have a well-balanced game in the start. And then as we add after that, both the classes that are currently planned and classes that will be planned and mapped out later that haven't even been designed or announced yet, that all of them continue to fit into this sort of set that we're building and have good interactions with each other and maintain a reasonable balance in the interrelationships throughout the entire course of the game's life cycle. So it's just sort of a constant struggle that we're going to have to deal with, as all games do, that isn't necessarily as negatively impacted by the rock, paper, scissors methodology as you might initially think.
I'm drawing Ben's beard. See? There.
Is this to say that we need more art questions?
No. I was just kind of zoning out on that.
You're
Probably
like, I don't
very
care about all
interesting
this
design
stuff.
question.
Here is an
And I was like,
art-related
"There's your
question.
beard."
Lotoween asks, when designing a new island/zone, do you first pick a real-world inspiration for the concept of the whole island, or do you start with a strategic layout and add biomes to fit subparts of the island?
It's kind of a little bit of both, because we don't actually have to. The look of it, one does not necessarily have to precede the other, because we can, with the terrain system, we can kind of build things that will work with whatever Ben makes. So if Ben makes a bunch of lumps and steep cliffs or something, we can make the terrain system, put textures and everything on there. Trees won't be on the sides of cliffs and things like that. So to a certain degree, design can kind of start mapping stuff out, and we certainly do start with some real world inspirations, just to kind of get the idea of what we want to do, and then you break that down and go, okay, well, I need these, like I'll sit there and break down the number of terrain textures, number of terrain mods. Sometimes Ben will just start with like whatever I've given him and kind of rough it out.
So initially when I'm designing an area, there's almost always an idea of what that area is supposed to be. If it's
A forest and fields.
well, yeah, sometimes. I mean, if it's
What were you gonna say?
it depends on the game, right? Like in our game, we have a lot of grassy hills and forest. Like that's sort of the assets
Yeah.
that we typically have for our current set. But if we're doing something more contrived and more highly design focused, it might be, this is a warehouse, or this is a factory, or this is a dock or something. And so even though you're using like just gray box geometry, right, with just primitives and stuff, you're still thinking of like, well, this is the thing that I have in mind. And sometimes you'll use real world examples, but other times it's like, well, I'm working on a sci-fi game, so I'm using movie examples, right? I'm not using real world. I'm using something out of part of Star Wars and part of this and part of that, right, to go with, okay, this is kind of the thematic feel of this area. It's not necessarily a real location, but it's a sort of idea of a location. And we'll work with concept art as well for things like that. And if it's especially a new area of an existing, say, planet, if you already have concepts of what that planet is supposed to be like, or what that faction or whatever is supposed to be like, then you sort of build upon that and say, well, this is a new zone as part of this overarching set, and it needs to look and feel as part of the other things that it's supposed to go along with. So there's usually that kind of thing. Very rarely, if you're making something just in total abstract, will you make something that's just pure design with no thematics at all, which does happen sometimes if you're just making, say, an FPS level.
That's what
you
I was
might,
thinking of.
You
block
might
it
just
out,
block
and
it
then
out.
it's like suddenly could be anything.
Yeah, where really there's no idea of what is all this stuff around. It's just a bunch of boxes and the triangles and squares and things. And why is it all like that? Well, just because it feels good and it's fun to play in.
Right.
And then we'll have to come up with a theme to paint over the top of it later. That is sometimes what happens, but it's in very specific cases where usually you'll have some idea of like, well, we're building this and it needs to be a level design based on this idea, and then art will go in later and actually do like a paint over of it as it fits with the original idea to make it look the way it was supposed to be concepted. But yeah, sometimes you'll have just
that
a
was
pure design,
FPS
not
was the
very
first
often.
thing I thought of, because I remember working on something James Bond, and it was just big gray layout of hallways or something, or we turned it into a Middle Eastern town, and that turned into a laboratory, and either one could have been switched out very easily.
Yeah.
Odovic asks, are there any plans to use gore to indicate recent battles, or perhaps follow blood drips from bleeds until healed?
So I think the latter one I think kind of also sounds like, being able to track people and things like that, and then having to track all that on the server and display it for certain people. We've talked about things like that. We've talked about gore and blood splatters, and I believe part of the problem with that was the, every so frames updating something that had happened on a character, decaling that character, and then doing that on the scale of some of our battles, which gets prohibitive. So at this time, we've kind of stayed away from it simply because there's some technical concerns, just performance, and then there was also just how much does this actually add in the short term versus some of the bigger core technical needs when we had talked about it at that time. But we certainly do have a lot of ideas for more bells and whistles visually. We just haven't hit all of those things yet.
So, scouts are supposed to be able to use tracking.
That's what I was thinking of, yeah. I just don't remember what we talked about.
We haven't gotten into the details of that. We've talked about it a little bit, but haven't gotten into really any solid designs because we need to do a tech investigation into how exactly we can make it work.
And I think it was like storing, like mapping someone's path on the server.
Because we're going to have these heat maps of movement built into our metric system, if we can tie the scout functionality for doing tracking into that system, then we'll be able to have them run around in the world and use a detect tracks ability and say, well, 10 people walked through this way an hour ago. Because that data exists.
Yeah, I remember
it's
that
historically
that
recorded.
conversation.
And so that is something that we want to be able to provide for them. It might have to be broken down to as simple as, they hit their trackability and they can say, just do a big spatial query in the world and be like, there are some enemies that way.
Yeah.
Because there's no historical data there. That's just live data on the server. But I would like to be able to get into history in that sort of a way so that they can actually look back in time at a location and see what was going on. I think that would be super interesting and make that class very interesting to play at a sort of strategic level.
Ban Jones asks, will you be able to climb trees to view the landscape better or hide/ambush?
Technically, yes and no. I mean, certain trees you couldn't, and some trees you could. We built some trees that have collision on their branches, and then there's like pine trees you can't climb the pine tree.
Make me climbing animation.
No.
This is why I don't have fun things.
There's certain trees that certainly do have like big branches. I think some of those splayed out beech trees have big collision branches on them.
Yeah. Well, when you say climbing, what you really mean is it's a jumping puzzle. Right?
Yeah. Like what he said, like ambush something. Like you could technically get up into these things.
We've talked about. Remember when we did the accidental gigantic trees?
Right.
And then we were like, actually, we should build this into like a tree where you can actually,
so
it's basically the trunk of the tree has like a ramp and you can just
walk
up
one
the
thing
tree.
I never got back to was that whole like dark forest kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that was where I had specifically built very large trees and that had made sure that you could get up most of them. Mm-hmm. And we put a quick zone just together to kind of figure out the scale of it. So I'd like to get back to some of that kind of stuff. It's just we haven't done that recently. But there isn't like a just scrabble up a thing. But I think we want that for ladders, for sieges and stuff.
Yeah, we do want to have a way to use ladders. I don't know if that will actually
it's not a
to
climb
other
everything
objects.
type of thing.
Yeah, we don't have just a general
unless like
parkour sort of
we
system.
implement it and one of the engineers is like, oh my god, I can climb everything now. I don't know. And then watch designs head explode.
It might just spontaneously happen.
Yeah,
but
that does happen sometimes.
Yeah.
Everyday Engineering asks, do you plan on putting Easter eggs in CU? If so, who gets to make the decision on what becomes an egg?
Generally, that's the type of thing that is open to anybody saying, hey, I've got a cool idea. I mean, Mark always engenders that type of thinking. Like, if you've got a cool idea, let us know and speak up. And if we go, hey, that's cool, and can't figure out like some terrible legal reason or game-breaking reason not to do it. I mean, just for fun, what was that one stump we made with the little marmot down in it? And it was from like a internet meme that I had seen. And we did the square Minecraft tree for a while. Was in a few zones that people were enjoying finding. I would still like to have a little spot in the game, where you come across and there's a bunch of square trees, just for fun, things like that.
Lots of discussion.
Plus, Mark really likes those things too. So, like I said, engenders that thinking.
Junie on the YouTube asks, how much thought have you given on how much the class design and abilities affect the design of fortresses, considering all the magic abilities?
So, because our fortresses are built by players, that's something more in the hands of players to take into consideration than it is for us to do. To some extent, we do take that into account because we have a world in which players can build their own castles of, like, if we have too much ability to do knockback, or if the area of effects are too big or whatever, if that's going to create issues with player-built structures, or how will players have to build structures in order to account for these sort of things. But it is really something that I expect to go far beyond what we would think of when players get into designing their buildings against specific classes or against the classes that the other realms have. So how will, TDD buildings end up looking, because they have to deal with Arthurians and Vikings, but Vikings and Arthurians have to deal with TDD, so that TDD not having to deal with themselves don't have to build their buildings in such a way that have to deal with their own classes, so their buildings end up looking different. We'll see. I think that's an interesting thing to think about, but not necessarily something that gets a lot of deliberate design attention, because it is going to end up being something that players really take into consideration a lot more when they're building their own buildings.
Hambone Flex on the YouTube chat asks, will you make any NPC characters based on your resemblance? If I'm in the main city, can I buy materials from a long bearded NPC sporting a leather jacket?
I don't think anybody's ever asked that.
I don't think so either. People do that in video games quite a bit. I
think that's just
I don't think
time
anybody was
allowing,
planning to do
artist
anything
goes
like
off
that.
and does it on their own.
Artists tend to. So when you're asking about Easter eggs, artists tend to just stick things into
Yeah.
the game like without asking anyone or telling
Yeah.
anyone,
And
then
you gotta be
they get
careful with that.
discovered by players years later, and then people
Yeah.
wonder how they got away with putting that in the game.
True fact. I am on 3 different tombstones in
Are
one
you?
of the cemeteries in Vampire the Masquerade.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like-
There's a Civil War photo of me in a Godfather game. There's one time when I can't remember what game we were working on. There was a web game called O
No,
Game.
you're good, you're good.
And we put a giant spaceship floating around in the game's world that we eventually had to take out on launch because obviously it wasn't our IP. I mean, we just did, you do fun things. One random crazy engineer puts a dragon flying around in the sky randomly to see if it works.
And now it's on fucking
And
And
then
fire.
we
it's
set it on
permanent.
fire, yeah.
Yeah. Also, Myth 3. We just the various like enemy hero units, like the sub commanders and all that. We just took pictures of
Yeah,
our
yeah,
faces and
yeah.
put them on the characters.
Well, that was
so-
how several of us got put in the background pictures, and we all had to sign NDAs for just some. And if you go look on YouTube, there's the first Godfather game. Like I spotted the picture in there, and I remember going, "Oh, I made that. I forgot I made that. No, there's the picture of me."
Yeah, so good chance, like probably
Yeah,
like
artists
pictures of
generally do
our
it.
faces end up as head options.
Oh,
in
yeah,
there.
yeah.
I mean, because it's easier than modeling a head.
Yeah, I mean, if we ever wanted to do pictures and things that you can place, as BPOs or something, I could see us, stylizing like a little helmet and everything on an actual photo of one of us. That'd be fun.
Yeah, I think we should do it. I think we should have a cash shop that just sells pictures
Pictures
of
of
Tyler.
us,
Just Tyler, actually.
like this.
Like
So yes, that's definitely a thing.
yeah.
Oh man, we got a bunch of questions all at once here.
Because
Okay.
are they all some of the engineering questions for Andrew? Is that what just happened?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought that was what happened.
Chat system, will it be made by CSC and not a third party as originally planned?
Oh, Andrew can.
Yeah, I can jump back into that. Yeah, we had some thoughts on using a third-party chat system, and things just did not quite align to give for that to happen. And so we are
So now
back to CSE chat, and that like the core of that just got merged on Monday.
And then
it's not really totally.
It's the Linux pass and the
100%
UI
live,
pass
yeah.
that needs to happen. Yeah.
So we're going to deploy a new chat server once that's fully stabilized and running on Linux and everything else.
Yep.
So yeah, that is mostly done except for I's dotted and T's crossed, and JB is the person who did the bulk of it, and JB is always like working on 6 different things.
Yeah.
So
Cool. Well, thanks for jumping back in for the tech question. All right. Adjust the camera. Byproducts asks, since we've been talking scouts, what do you expect the speed of information travel to be?
The speed of information travel is about as fast as a swallow.
Unladen. I wasn't really sure what that.
Latent
I
or
think
unladen?
maybe like Scout goes out and gets back. I don't know
So
what that's referring to.
there's a sort of either someone has been paying very close attention and knows what we're specifically building for that, or someone is just asking a random question and happens to get into all these mechanics. But the idea of scouts is that they're going to go out and do cartography basically and get scouting reports together and then deliver those scouting reports into a specific location. But that location will give out the information that has been gathered and delivered to them. It won't be necessarily global information, so it's not that everybody knows everything all the time. But then the information will disperse from there to other locations as part of the caravan system. So the information from one place will go to another. But the travel of that is like more in real time than it is automatic. But that is something that we've talked about more, again, in sort of isolated conversations, not necessarily has been written into any formalized designs yet, because we haven't gotten really far into the development of scouts versus a lot of the other things that we've gotten a lot more in depth with, as far as the combat mechanics and the specific abilities of a lot of the other classes. And so it might work out as we get into implementing and then getting into testing scouts, especially, that the lack of information being updated across the world is a detriment to the overall gameplay, and then we need to come up with some other mechanic than the literal transportation of caravans from place to place. That's just sort of a automatic background thing that happens, and that can be intercepted, and caravans can be killed off, and so that information then also gets cut off and things like that. It might turn out to be that, like, that's just wrecking the game, and we need to just automatically give these updates either on some timer or through some other means to more easily allow information to show up across the game, because then that allows players to react to that information and play the game in a more informed way, and makes it easier to find fights and to defend things that are under attack, and all those sorts of things, which might be very difficult if that information isn't as available. So we'll see. Again, it's something that we will be looking at as we get into testing this, and it is very important for us to have a good feel to the flow of the overall RVR experience, and having information is a big part of that. And so how well that information and how quickly that information moves around and is distributed across a realm is something that we'll be looking at and making changes to in order to get the best overall feel.
All right, 4-minute warning. 4-minute warning, folks. And there are some awesome questions. I see you folks on YouTube also put in a bunch of questions recently, and we're not going to get to all the questions today, so please, if you're a backer, pop on the forums and put them up. Come back again for another Q&A and ask them again later.
Or ask Max every morning.
Or ask me every Monday and Friday morning until and get me to tell you to come back on Friday. But please, we appreciate that you folks hop on here and ask questions. Lotoween asks, how often does a new art concept turn into a change for a game design? And how does art go about expressing a new game design that hasn't been fully fleshed out?
Well, art usually concepts the things that design asks for. So there's chaos happening. The usual workflow for things is that there needs to be a design for something, and so a design gets written up, and then the design gets handed off to art, and then concept art gets drawn for what the thing is actually supposed to look like, and then the concept art goes into modeling, and then animations and particles and all these other things. And so it isn't usually that concept is just spitting out imagery and then design is being, oh, that's cool, we'll turn that into something. What happens in those cases is more of design will ask for something, and then we'll get a bunch of concepts back, and some of the concepts don't necessarily fit with what was originally intended, but are really cool, and so then design has to go back and be like, well, what can we do with that? That's really cool. We want to put it in the game somehow. We'll come up with a design for it that isn't what we originally thought of, but we came up with a cool thing, and we'll make it, and we'll put it into the game as something else. So that's typically how that workflow goes.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I'd say it's kind of rare to just come up with something and then design goes. Because concept is defined by that ask originally.
Concept is tasked out. They're busy doing stuff, and the stuff that they're doing is stuff that is designed and needs to go into the game, right? So they're never just sitting around being like, I think I'll draw, X random thing. The stuff they're drawing is stuff they're supposed to be drawing because they're on a pipeline to get everything.
Granted, it does happen if you are just kind of spitballing something in a sketchbook. That's where it would be like, oh, hey, I had this idea. What do you think of this? Ooh, that's cool. That does happen every once in a while, but it's usually on your own time.
Yeah.
I literally was drawing something the other day that I was going to show you or Mark at some point and go, do you think this was cool? That kind of thing.
Well, anyone at the studio really can come up with a random idea and be like, I think this would be really cool. Or I was playing this other game and I saw something that's kind of like this and we should do something like that in our game. Or I saw this in a movie. Or I was just...
Or could we repurpose this thing we made to also do the thing you've asked for?
Well, yeah, that happens too. Where when we put something into the game and then people are like, this thing would really be better if it was doing this other thing that we didn't necessarily think of, and then we go, oh, that's amazing, we're going to make it start doing that thing. And so we end up repurposing or changing the design of things, and that's just a part of feedback, really, when you put something into the game and people don't like it or really like it in a way you didn't expect. And so you're like, they like it in a way we didn't expect it. Let's just go with it, because that ends up being fun. So that's a lot of things end up going not as planned in games, and sometimes if you're very clever, you can come up with a way to actually make that improve rather than just be a...
I think Andrew wants to say something, so I was going to make an introduction because I believe at one point...
Are you going to introduce Andrew now?
Well, he had a bug thing that he was telling me about where it was in Skyrim, the giant punting you.
Oh, yeah. All right.
That's a good
Skyrim
intro for
story.
you related to that question.
So, the giant pit punting you in Skyrim was just a bug.
Yeah.
Like, originally, it was just someone just, like, put an extra 0 on that, and everyone was like, that's cool, we're shipping that.
Yeah.
So, so we about wrapping up here?
Yep.
Yeah, we're at
Okay.
the time.
So I want to, come in and say one thing at the end. I mentioned working on Myth 3. There was a good friend of mine on that team, also a friend of Mark Hernandez, who died this week. Craig Goodman was a lot of things going around in game developer internet for his work at Insomniac Games. He helped define Ratchet and Clank all the way up through Spider-Man. And I worked with him on Myth at his very first job in the game industry. Like, he was a mod, he had made a bunch of like cool mods for Myth 1 and 2, and he was just like working at a shoe store in Kansas, and like we hired him out of that, and he ended up having like a massive career. And he was a guy who always stood up for what was like right in a way that was not always politically expedient in the game industry. And he was a guy who absolutely lived games. He spent about 6 years fighting brain cancer. Even like 2 weeks before he died, he was still like playing Spider-Man on his deathbed, like past the point when he could necessarily even really talk that well. But he was like, that's my game, and I'm going to play it. And so I just wanted to say, Craig, man, wherever you are, it was a privilege to know and work with you. And to everyone at Insomniac who's, spent a lot more time with him recently, I am sorry for your loss a lot, too. So.
And maybe a lesson to all the other people out there who are thinking about maybe making video games. Make mods.
Yeah, no, it was just, we hired him cold. It was just like, we cold called him working at a shoe store in Kansas, and we're like, we like your mod, we need another level designer.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Sometimes, enthusiasm and hard work, you get noticed.
Yep.
No, so. Anyway, not to be, I didn't mean to be sad.
No, that's amazing.
I want to celebrate the good things about him,
Yeah.
not, be morbid.
No, that wasn't morbid.
And,
sometimes you can miss people.
Yeah. So, here's to Craig.
Yep.
Here's to Craig.
I'm not drinking today, but...
Not today.
Okay.
All right. So we will see you...
Later.
Yes.
Are you trying to get us all to do it at the same time?
1, 2, 3.
See you later.